$100 MBA Show, and today is a Q&A weekend episode where I answer a question of yours right here on the show. If you want to ask a question, just email us at contact@100mba.net or use our speak it option, record your question, we'll play it right here on the show. You can check that out at 100mba.net/show. As always, I'm your host, your coach, your teacher, Omar Zenhom. I'm also the co-founder of the $100 MBA, a complete business training and community online. And today's question comes from Josh. And Josh asks, can I start a podcast with 4 to 5 people? Is that even possible? Good question, Josh. And I'm going to answer it right here on today's episode. So let's get down to business. This episode of the $100 MBA Show is brought to you by Nadex Binary Options Trading. Our listeners appreciate just how far $100 can go, and so does Nadex. With just $100, you can get started. With Nadex Binary Options, you trade on whether you think the market will be above or below a certain point by a certain time. Go to nadex.com and open up a free account. That's nadex.com, nadex.com. Futures, options, and swaps trading involves risk and may not be appropriate for all investors. So Josh asks if you could start a podcast with 4 or 5 people. He asks, is this even possible? Well, definitely it's possible because a podcast has a lot of components. It's not just the person on the mic or the people on the mic that make up a podcast. So you could definitely have 4 to 5 people working on the production of the podcast itself. So one of them can be the host, or maybe 2 of them can be co-hosts, and you can have somebody else working in post-production. You know, we don't do this podcast alone. You know, I am the host of the show, but Nicole is the producer and the editor. We also have a content coordinator who takes care of, you know, putting up this material on our website and making sure it publishes properly on iTunes. And you're going to need somebody to market your podcast on social media, answer questions, take in questions, answer emails, things like that. So having more than one person work on a podcast is a good idea. You're going to need as much help as you can get. But having more than, I would say, 2 people on the mic, I haven't really seen a podcast with more than 2 hosts or co-hosts really work well, because with the audio format, sometimes it's hard to keep track of who is saying what. You know, especially if you're new to the show, you're not really familiar with the voices. You know, I've seen shows with 3 people, but it's a discussion show and it's just them 3. If it's an interview show, remember that you're going to have, you know, the host, the co-host, plus the interviewee. So I really haven't seen anybody really do this properly with more than 3 voices on the call. Nicole and I used to do interviews in a previous life, in a previous show, and it was Nicole and I, and sometimes we'd interview 2 people at the same time. They're partners in their business. And there were 4 people on this call, and it got confusing sometimes who is saying what, because again, there are no visuals. And if you're not familiar with people's voices, or these people are new to them, it's going to be hard to keep track of. So just keep that in mind when it comes to producing your podcast, how many voices will be heard on the podcast. Now, obviously, if it's a discussion podcast and everybody has different types of voices, and people start to get familiar with these voices week in, week out, or episode in, episode out, they'll know who's saying what. But if it's an interview show and you throw in a new voice every week or every episode, then it gets a little bit tricky, especially when it's not one-on-one. Because when it's one-on-one, you know that that's the host, and the host is asking the questions, that's the voice of the host, and the other person answering them is the person that's the guest. It gets a little tricky when you have co-hosts or more than 2 hosts on the show. But remember, it takes more than a host to make a successful podcast. I personally think a lot of the success that we've had with the $100 MBA Show and Webinar Ninja or other podcasts is the production value, is the editing. And I'm lucky enough to have somebody who's brilliant at that. Nicole is fantastic at it. She actually comes from a film background. She graduated from the New York Film Academy, and she loves the editing process on film or in audio. And one of the insights I learned by knowing Nicole and being a part of her life is that, you know, the editor on a film is paid huge bucks because they really could dictate how a story is told. The edit is really what makes the movie. You know, you have a storyline, you have a script, all that stuff is, you know, contributes to it, but the edit really puts it together and makes it really magical and really makes it communicate and resonate with people. And the same goes with podcasting, with an audio story or an audio experience. You don't have to be telling a story, but the way the show is presented can greatly be altered in a positive way in the edit to make sure that it is to the point and make sure that it actually delivers on what it's promising. So I would definitely invest in somebody that is focused on that task. I say somebody, but it could be more than one person. It could be one or two people. So definitely you could start a podcast with 4 or 5 people, but broaden your horizons when it comes to what these 4 or 5 people are going to do in creating this podcast. I got more for Josh and this question, but before that, I got to give some love to today's sponsor, infofree.com. I know many of you are struggling to find new customers. Trust me, I've been there. Most contact lists are outdated and don't have sales leads that are right for your business. But let me tell you about a service I found that makes selling pretty easy. Infofree.com. And by the way, they're offering a free trial to the listeners of this podcast. Infofree.com's data is so accurate that it was even featured on 60 Minutes. Do you want to reach prospects with phone calls, emails, or direct mail? Infofree.com has you covered with its database of 14 million businesses and 220 million consumers. It gives you the power to target the specific leads that are right for your business. And with the free trial, you have nothing to lose. Infofree.com even has a free mobile app that gives you the ability to access all your sales leads and research any business before you call. Use the app on your iPhone or Android to qualify your leads within seconds. To get the free trial of Infofree.com, just go to infofree.com/MBA. If you want to double your sales, check them out. Infofree.com/MBA. Now, Josh, you might be wondering, how do I know what these 4 or 5 people on my team are going to do on the podcast? Who's going to do what? Well, the first thing you need to nail down is what's the objective of your podcast? What are you trying to accomplish? What do you want to do? How do you want to serve your audience on that podcast? What differentiates you from the other podcasts? These questions, or the answers to these questions, are going to help you find out what needs to be done in order to have a great podcast. The second thing you have to do is figure out the format of your podcast. Is it going to be a discussion format? Is it going to be an interview format? Will it be lesson-based like this show? How will your listeners consume your content? Once you have those down, you'll kind of understand the way your show is going to look like. Now it's time for you to fill in the gaps, find out where you need help in. Who's the best host? Who can come up with the content? Who has the ability to edit this podcast, this format of a podcast properly? Or even if they don't have the skills, who is willing or wants to be trained to be able to edit the podcast? These are all questions you'll be able to answer once you've nailed down those fundamentals of how you're going to serve your audience, what's the format of the podcast, and you take a look at your team and see who is interested in what, and who's best for each part of the equation. You want to make sure that you're using everybody's strengths in the right way. All right, Josh, I hope that answers your question. Thanks for communicating with us and sending in your question. Guys, if you want to send in a question for Q&A Weekends, don't forget, just email us at contact@100mba.net. or use our Speak It option, record your question, and we'll play right here on the show at 100mba.net/show. Or you can send me a tweet on Twitter at BizRepublic, B-I-Z Republic. Guys, if you haven't checked out our latest podcast, Webinar Ninja, a podcast all about how to teach, present, sell, and communicate effectively with your audience using webinars, I highly recommend you do. It's a really, really fun podcast. Nicole and I really enjoy creating it, and we're really proud of it, and we'd love for you to check it out. Just search Webinar Ninja in iTunes or whatever you're using to listen to podcasts. Guys, I want to leave you with this. I said this before, but starting a podcast is a large project. It's a production. I'm not saying this to discourage you or to make it sound like it's too daunting, but you really need to see it as a production. You got to come in with the right frame of mind and see yourself as a pro, that you're going to put in the work and the time and the manpower to make this happen properly. That's how successful shows become successful, is they take it seriously. They see it as a production of any kind of show, just like on TV or on radio. Shows are built with teams that are dedicated to their craft, that really want to improve. They're providing great quality content that people just love and eat up. And if you can aim for that, to create this great production, this great show for your audience, success will follow. All right, guys, I'll check you in tomorrow's episode, our second Q&A weekend episode. I'll see you then. Take care.